Mike Schmidt and Jimmy Song, why don't you guys come up next? Speaking of nonprofits, anyone hear something about Op Return? Is there something going on with Op Return?
Well, we'll put the fire and fireside here.
We'll put the fire and fireside. I'm just going to say Op Return and then stop talking.
Let's start with what Brink is doing and what your role is so we can sort of introduce ourselves.
My name is Mike Schmidt. I'm the executive director at Brink. We're a 501c3 charity in the U.S. We also have a UK subsidiary, and we're focused on funding the developers and engineers that are working on the Bitcoin code base that underpins much of the network. And we've been doing that for just about 5 years now.
And if you haven't checked out their brink.dev is the website. I highly recommend checking them out. Who are you, Jimmy?
Yeah, I'm Jimmy Song. I write books and I shit post on Twitter.
The vast majority of the work that these engineers do is what I would qualify as like maintenance work. So we have this digital money, this Bitcoin, right? But it's all based on code. And if that's observation one, then observation two is that all code at least requires some form of maintenance and upkeep, right? So that's things like proactive testing to make sure that the engineers find the bugs before somebody who's trying to exploit them does, ensuring that the software runs on the next version of Mac OS or Windows, these sorts of things, that it runs a little bit quicker. If there's like an iceberg, that's the underwater. Not many people pay attention to it. It's not very controversial. In fact, there was a vulnerability released in the last week, and I don't think anybody here probably knows about that or cares about that. But if you work your way out of that iceberg and you work your way up, at the top was probably the thing that most people are familiar with, which is like the Bitcoin protocol. These would be consensus changes to the way that Bitcoin, the protocol, works, and that's just a small fraction of the work that these engineers are doing. But sort of in between that very controversial consensus and this boring maintenance is something called policy. So you have these nodes on the network and they need to pass blocks around. The blocks are consensus, but you have policy and you have this peer-to-peer layer, and that's can also be interesting.
Yeah, that peer-to-peer layer it's the decentralized network, right? This is the way in which transactions are put back and forth. And it's a gossip network, which means that everyone tells everyone else about the stuff that they know. Now, what the policy does is that sometimes it says, okay, this is more than 100,000 bytes, this transaction. That's too big. It is legal to put it into a block, but I'm not going to transmit it because it's going to be too much bandwidth or something else. Also, if an output is under what's called the dust limit, and that varies based on the specific script type. So if it's under like 546, I think, for pay to pub key hash, then I'm not going to transmit it because it's kind of impractical to spend and it's going to cost too much. So let's not do that. But there are all kinds of these policy things, and that brings us to the current controversy. Do you want to talk a little bit about Citria and what they were trying to do, and maybe that can give them.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback a little bit on like this policy explanation. Mm-hmm. If you think of consensus as Bitcoin's rules, there's a slightly tighter version of those rules that Jimmy referred to here, which is policy. The majority of these policy rules are in place to prevent things like denial of service attacks. So you can imagine what you're doing when you're running a Bitcoin node is you're opening up your computer to the entire network and the entire world to send you anything, right? You're saying, attack me, essentially. So there needs to be some additional rules in place that help that node protect itself. For example, you can't be sent the same transaction millions of times per second or with slightly increasing fee. That would be inappropriate, and then you would kick that partner off the network from you, right? And so a lot of the rules are around that.
Just what happened with Citria, just give them a background, right?
I'll take a little bit of fault at this. I've very much encouraged the Bitcoin core developers to engage more with the community. I think there's a natural division of responsibility that's happened as this community has grown, and the engineers are sort of off over there. There's financial people over there. There's this whole thing, mining, a whole new industry that's over there. And I've encouraged the core developers to engage with the broader industry and present at conferences and these sorts of things. At one of these events, one of the engineers met one of the layer 2 protocol engineers and heard what they were working on. The example of what they were working on pointed out an inconsistency in what this a certain policy was on the network, and it actually incentivized worse behavior compared to better behavior. So the engineer went to make what he thought was a small change for a small reward.
So it turns out that this particular policy has a very long history, going back all the way to 2000 and so on. And it's basically, if you look at the actual Bitcoin core RPC commands and stuff, it's called data carrier size. And it's how much data you can put into an output on any given transaction. You're allowed to have one output that is op return followed by data, some amount of data. And for a while there, I think it was 40 bytes, and then it changed to 80. And then, there's like the op return code and then the length. So it ends up being like 83 bytes is the absolute maximum that you can have in that op return. And that's been the policy for a while. But because of the Citria change, they needed 160 bytes in an emergency situation, if I'm understanding correctly. Like if you haven't heard of Citria, they're BitVM guys. They're working on some very different type of smart contracting, and it's enabled by Taproot. But they need some sort of failover where they need to store about 160 bytes on chain. And what they were saying that they would do is that they would make it into pay to Taproot pub keys, right? So those can store 32 arbitrary bytes, more or less.
It's like a fake address.
Yeah, it's a fake address, which they don't have a private key. So for them, they could store it in about 5 of those. That would be roughly 160 bytes. And instead of putting it into a single op return, which would only get them 80 bytes of arbitrary data, they would have to have 2 transactions. Their architecture doesn't allow for that. So they were going to have 5 different pay-to-Taproot outputs, all of which would be a fake key, in which case that would go into the UTXO set. And so this is the trade-off that we had. And unfortunately, this blew up to be a much bigger thing because the pull request said instead of changing it from 80 to 160 or something like that, it was not just get rid of the limit entirely, but let's deprecate the option so that node runners don't even have the option of changing it. So setting their own policy. So that's kind of what the controversy is about. We have about 1:45. We can talk. I don't know if that's enough time to actually go through the various things. But
where are we now with the updates?
The latest is that the one that didn't allow an option has been closed. There's a new pull request that keeps the option in deprecated status. Deprecated meaning at some point it's marked for removal, although there's plenty of those options in the code base now that have been there for years, so there's not necessarily a timeline on that. So people will have an option to enable whatever value they think is appropriate for the coming years, perhaps.
And part of that controversy is the default is usually what most people run, right? When they are running their node, they go download Bitcoin Core, they go and do the initial block download or whatever. Most people aren't interested in figuring out exactly what their policy is. So the default ends up kind of mattering because most people don't actually change them. In this case, for this particular pull request, if I understand it, the default would be 100,000, which is also the limit for how large a transaction can be, in which case it's not really a limit at all. There are other rules that would sort of filter it at this point. So that's kind of what we've been arguing about on Twitter for the last 3 weeks. So that's an overview. We're pretty much at time.
Totally.
So
but what I want to say is not only thank you, but I think this was a great explanation. Mike, the Iceberg explanation is for a Luddite like me, left side of the bell curve, looking like a moron. I actually got that. Maintenance, consensus, policy. Maintenance, consensus, policy. And like both you guys just maybe get on another podcast or whatever. We need more podcasts, right? Conf Improve. Can you guys give these?
Studio right there.
We got a studio. Fix the money, fix the world. Give these folks a huge round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rod.